Hey guys, this is Gene Jensen. Today I really wanted to go fishing, but I got my boat out and it is an absolute disaster. It needs to be organized, reorganized, cleaned, washed, everything else. I've been fishing pretty hard and this summer's been just like any other summer for me. It's been pretty tough. But a question I've had pop up quite a bit, especially since doing that football head jig or that football jig video the other day, is about the different types of jigs, different types of jig heads. So that's exactly what I'm going to cover today. All right, well, doing research for this video, I realized exactly why there's so much question and so much confusion about the different types of jig heads. There are so many different types and everything else that, holy cow, I bet you there's a new one invented every day. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to kind of bring it down to a basic, this is what I look for in a jig head and this is what each of the jig heads is for. So I brought it down to several different categories. Hey! Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. If you haven't yet, hit that little button down there. Subscribe. It's free. Thanks. All right, one is a casting jig. One is a swim jig. Then there's a finesse jig. I got a list down here on the floor. That's why I keep looking down there. Finesse jig, a flipping jig, a football jig, a grass head, and a bladed swim jig. So of all of those, I'm going to try to go through each of them and kind of talk about what they are. Let's start off with casting jig. What the heck is a casting jig? Every jig you cast. It doesn't make any sense to me, and that was the most confusing of all the jigs, and that's why I'm starting with it. There are so many different jigs that can be a flipping jig, a casting jig, a heavy color jig. They can all be the same exact thing, and that's kind of where I have settled, you know, in the things that I like to do. So I'm going to break out what I consider a casting jig. All right, this is your standard, typical, everyday, ordinary archy head jig, okay? Now I'm going to zoom in real close when I talk about these. All right, so let's start off talking about casting jigs. What the heck is a casting jig? I mean, any jig can be casted out. I mean, and I really, to this point, until I started doing research on a casting jig for this video, I didn't know there was such thing as just a strictly casting jig. And you know what? To this point, I still don't think there's such thing as just a specific casting jig. Because a lot of jigs can go as casting jigs, flipping jigs, heavy cover jigs, any kind of jig you want. They'll all fall into, or some of them will fall into a bunch of these different categories. So a casting jig is basically something that you can just basically cast out and work slowly or quickly or however back to the boat. If I have to say, it's probably the most versatile type of jig because it does cover so many different head shapes. A good casting jig, one that I like more than anything, is basically your archy head jig. Okay, so it's a archy head jig is my favorite to skip underneath docks and to work through wooded cover and things like that. It really does come through cover really well when you're fishing brush piles. What I look for in a good archy head jig is when you lay it flat down, I want that jig, that's hard to do in my hand, I want that hook to come up at an angle. I don't want it to lay flat. I used to have some old style archy head jigs that when they hit the bottom they would lay flat with a hook just like that. I missed so many stinking fish until I figured out that it was because the hook angle just coming off the bottom was what really made a difference, and I started catching fish after I changed up. Now, so a casting jig is basically, you know, a heavy cover jig. That's a football head. Heavy cover jig can be a casting jig, just something you can work along the bank, cast out and bring back to you without getting hung up too bad. The next one would be a swim jig. A swim jig is somewhat of a special creature. It's one that you can fish a lot like a spinnerbait, but it doesn't have a spinnerbait blade on it. It typically has a shad-shaped head on it, not flat on the bottom. If you lay it down, it falls down on its side, so it's not something you want to fish like a jig fished on the bottom. Has a vertical line tie, so it cuts through the grass and through the cover really, really well. And it's basically, it's fished just like a spinnerbait, but maybe you apply a little bit more action with the tip, shaking your rod while you're reeling it or hopping it or bouncing it around really, really fast. It's a reaction style bait. I don't really consider this a jig because I fish it like a spinnerbait, but they call it a swim jig. One of the things I really do consider when I'm fishing a swim jig, especially in the grass, is the type of knot I use. If you use a Palomar knot, your tag end tends to go back towards your rod. Am I correct? When you tie a Palomar knot, tighten it down, clip your tag end and the rest of that tag end goes back towards your rod, what that causes is a lot of grass to get caught up. So I would never tie a Palomar knot to a swim jig if I'm fishing it in the grass. Basically, I wouldn't tie it to any jig if I'm fishing it in the grass. I want something that the line tie goes the opposite direction or off to the side a little bit. So what I do is I tie an improved clinch knot and I tuck that tag in back in through the eye of the hook and nip it off on the other side so it is pointing the other direction. All right, now let's talk about a finesse jig. Holy cow. A finesse jig is just a little teeny tiny downsized jig with a light wire hook. The things I would change up from a normal size jig to a finesse jig is I'd change my rod, my line, everything. I'd go to a medium action rod instead of a medium heavy or a heavy action rod. I'd go to lighter pound test, 10, 12 pound test line. And this is one that you just kind of flip around light cover down in the bottom of the root balls of trees, and you just bring it up to something and start to shake it. They're typically a round ball head jig, and so a lot of times when they land, they'll fall on their side, so it's kind of something you want to keep moving, keep shaking. Consider it a shaky head with a jig skirt, kind of. And you just fish it slow, and when the fish want a smaller bite, this is the kind of stuff you go to. Just a little finesse style jig. The skirt's been trimmed down. There's half the skirt there. It just, you know, it's just downsized. This is one that I tied myself many moons ago. Now for a heavy cover or a flipping jig, as they call it. My favorite flipping jig is the Seabird Outdoors little brush jig that they make. It's got a vertical line tie, as you can see, like that. But it's the lead itself is molded around the line tie, and a lot of them are like this. Any kind of a heavy cover jig is going to have that line tie protected, or going to have a shape in which it can get through, punch in through cover. What I like about this one is when it lands almost upright, so it's kind of a stand-up jig, and the hook is up there, so when the bass grabs the trailer, he grabs a mouthful of hook, and that's what I want. Heavy cover jigs are exactly what they're called. Or flipping jigs are just jigs you can get down into heavy cover and get a big fish out. They'll have big heavy hooks, fish them on a big heavy rod with a heavy line, and they're probably my favorite baits to fish, or jigs to fish, because the bite is always just boom, and they just thump it, and you set it hard, and it's like full combat fishing. The football head jig. I just made a video the other day about a football jig. It is a dragging jig, or a casting jig if you want to call it, because you cast it out and you drag it back to you. You want to mimic a crawfish. You look at the head, it's shaped like a football. A lot of times when it falls, it wiggles as it falls down. But what I like about it is it's designed to come and make a lot of commotion on the bottom with very little movement, and you're fishing rocks and cover, you know, hard bottom, long points, dragging it along really slowly, looking like a crawfish. And then the biggest key to this is the hook set. Man, this one's got a rusty hook. I need to throw it out. But is the hook set is when you have a big heavy one like this 3/4 ounce, you really have to be careful on that hook set. You gotta reel down, tighten up your rod, get the rod to start bending, and then hammer home from there. And that will prevent what we call blowout, or the fish's mouth blowing open and the bait just coming out of its mouth on the hook set. Football head jigs are a lot of fun. This is the Gridiron G Iron Jig. It's from a series that I actually designed the colors on a series of jigs for Seabird Outdoors, and I like it because it's a football head, but it's also a stand-up. It stands up a little bit better. You get a better bite. The fish gets all the hook in its mouth on a bite. All right, now we are going to skip the grass jig. I know I mentioned it at the beginning of the video, but I don't have one. And I use a heavy cover jig instead of a grass jig. They're pretty much the same thing. It's going to have a little bit pointed, more pointed head, and it's going to have a vertical line tie is what it's going to have. This is an archy head, but it's kind of like this, but with a pointed head. So last but not least is the bladed swim jig, and it is a swim jig head. Looks like a spinnerbait head that is fished like a crankbait. It's got a bladed jig on the front, vertical line tie, and really good in the grass, really bad in the wood. All right, so to try to clear up some of the confusion behind a jig and all these different style of jig heads, you just got to consider, okay, what am I using it for? What is this jig going to look like when it lands on the bottom? Where's the hook going to be? Where's my trailer going to be? What's the skirt going to do? Is it going to be able to get into and out of the cover that I'm throwing it at? Is it going to be able to be effective in that cover? And you look at the heads and say, okay, a football head jig is not going to work good in the grass. It's got a big old wide head. It's going to get hung up in the grass. It's going to pull a bunch of it out with it. Not a good grass jig. A heavy cover jig probably is not going to be a very good dragging jig, because it is one that lands upright, and when you start to drag it, a lot of times these suckers will want to fall over in the water, and you don't really want to do it. It's one of those jigs that you flip in and you hop around. Any jig that lands upright like that, and there's a lot of different ones that they're going to have a hard time when you want to drag them like a shaky head or drag them like a regular dragging jig. And so you want one like a football head that's designed for that hook to stay upright, even though you're manipulating it through cover. Or for instance, an arky head does the same thing. It stays upright even if you're manipulating it through cover. So you really have to just pay attention to what the bait does when it hits the bottom, what the bait does when it's in the water, when it's falling, and how it's going to come through the cover that you want to fish it. And it'll help you catch more fish on a jig. If they're in a chasing mood, throw a swim jig, throw a bladed swim jig. If they're not in a chasing mood and they're tight to cover, throw something that's in that cover. If they're on the bottom, throw something that lands on the bottom nicely. If they're up top, up around the canopy in a grass bed, just throw anything that can punch through that canopy in that grass bed and come up and bang it on the top. So, you know, just consider what you're using, and what you need and how you want to fish, and you'll always pick the right jig head. Well, like I always say, be sure to introduce somebody to fishing. Introduce them to my channel. Let me help you teach them how to fish. More importantly, get out on the water, go out and catch some fish, and have a great day.